Colorado Territory. November 1876, the gunshot had happened 3 days ago. Nobody out here heard it. Nobody came. In the frozen willow scrub below the creek bend, something enormous lay face down in the snow. Too big for a deer, too still for a man still living. Except the blood beneath him hadn't frozen all the way through, which meant the heart was still working, barely, against everything it had any right to expect. On the hill above, a woman stood at a chopping block with a dull axe and a winter's worth of arithmetic in her head, and not enough of either. She didn't know about the man in the snow yet. Her 9-year-old son did. He was already running. The November wind didn't blow in Colorado Territory. It scraped. It came down off the ridge like something with teeth, dragging itself across the tin roof of Ruth Hadley's cabin in long, shuddering pulls that made the whole structure sound like it was trying to peel itself off the frozen ground and give up entirely. Which, some mornings, Ruth understood completely. She stood at the chopping block in the gray half-dark before sunrise, the dull axe raised above her head, and she was not thinking about the cold. She was doing math, 14 logs left in the stack against the north wall. Maybe 16 if she counted the 2 she'd set aside because the bark was green and they'd smoke more than burn. The flour barrel had a week in it. 8 days if she made the biscuits thin. Pearl had outgrown her left boot and was packing the toe with a strip of feed sack to keep it on her foot, and the sacking was already starting to shred, and new boots at Garver's cost $4 she did not have, and the traps on the lower creek had given her 1 rabbit in 3 days. And the rabbit had been half frozen before she found it, which meant the meat had already started turning by the time she got it home, and she'd fed it to the children anyway, because there was nothing else. The axe came down, the pine log split clean, 2 pale halves falling away from each other, and the shock of impact ran up Ruth's forearms and settled deep in her shoulders where it lived now, permanent as the cold itself. She set up another log, raised the axe, kept the numbers running, because that was survival at this particular stage of it, not courage. Not the grit that people who had enough to eat used to describe the people who didn't. Survival at this stage was arithmetic, counting what you had against what you needed and making peace with the gap every single morning. Before the sun came up enough to call it day, Thomas had never been able to do that, not because he was weak. He'd been the kind of man who found something worth noticing in everything, who'd carried a book across 3 states, because he thought Pearl should hear good sentences even before she could understand them. He had a faith in forward motion that Ruth had once believed was contagious. 2 years since the cholera took him in August, 3 days from the first fever to the last breath. She had learned in those 3 days and in every day since that faith was not the thing that kept children fed through a Colorado winter. Math was the axe came down again. She kept working. She was still at it when Samuel came up the hill from the creek. He ran the way 9-year-old boys ran in oversized boots. Badly, the boots belonging to his father and swallowing his calves whole, his thin legs lifting with each stride like he was trying to shake them loose. His breath plumed in rapid bursts. His cheeks carried the particular red of cold skin over not enough fat, and Ruth catalogued it the same way she catalogued everything now, as a problem with a solution she hadn't found yet. Ma. He stopped a few feet away, hands on his knees catching his breath. There's a bear down in the willows, past the second bend. I think it's dead. Ruth set the axe head against the frozen dirt. A dead bear. The calculation happened before she'd finished hearing the sentence. 100 pounds of meat, maybe more if it was a big one. Rendered fat for cooking and for packing the gaps in the window chinking. Hide enough to make both children proper winter coats, or to trade at Garver's for enough flour to carry them through February. A dead bear in early November was not a tragedy. A dead bear was the difference between February and nothing. Stay close. She left the axe against the block and took the Sharp's rifle from where it leaned against the cabin wall, her thumb settling near the hammer out of habit. Don't get ahead of me. The path down to the creek was treacherous in the way of things that looked passable and weren't. Frozen mud had humped itself into ridges sharp enough to turn an ankle, and the dead grass along the bank wore a thin skin of ice that looked like solid ground until your boot went through it. Ruth moved carefully, reading the surface the way she'd learned to read most things out here, not with trust, but with suspicion and a plan for when the suspicion proved right. Pearl was still in the cabin. Pearl was always in the cabin in the mornings because Pearl was 6, and Ruth had explained, twice, That 6-year-old stayed by the fire until the world warmed up enough to be navigable, and Pearl accepted this with the gravity of a child who had learned early that her mother's rules were not arbitrary. They were load-bearing. Through the skeletal tangle of the willows, Ruth saw the shape dark, massive, half buried in a snowdrift where the cut bank curved. She slowed, brought the rifle up. Something was wrong with the shape, too flat, the profile too angular at the edges, no shoulder hump. She kept moving and the smell reached her before the shape finished resolving itself. Copper and wet fur and pine resin, and underneath those things the sweet wrong smell of something infected. She stopped 4 feet away, not a bear, a man. He lay face down in the snow, one arm bent under him, and one stretched above his head as though he'd been reaching for something when he fell. The sheer size of him registered first and kept registering, kept demanding she look again, because men were not generally built like this. The buffalo hide coat across his back was the width of a barn door. The boots, moccasin style, hand-stitched, calf-length and clearly made for someone who knew what feet needed on rough terrain, were the largest she had ever seen on a human being. His hand, the one stretched out in the snow above his head, lay open and palm up, and it was enormous. The hand of a man who had used it to do real things in real country for a long time. Is he dead? Samuel had stopped at her left shoulder. Ruth knelt. The snow soaked immediately through her skirt and into her stocking. She grabbed the heavy shoulder of the buffalo coat and pulled. The man was genuine dead weight, and it took everything she had to roll him onto his back. He came over with a sound like something dense hitting stone. His face was lost under frost-crusted beard and trail dirt, but his lips were the particular blue of a body that had been cold too long. His buckskin shirt had been torn at the right shoulder, the fabric board stiff with blood that had frozen and thawed and frozen again in layers. And through the wreckage of it she could see the wound itself, dark at the center, the skin around it pulled tight and hot-looking even in the cold air, red lines beginning to trace outward from the edges. She pressed 2 fingers against the icy skin of his neck, held still, counted there, a pulse. Weak as a creek in drought, and slow, she counted 3 full seconds between beats, but present. Ruth sat back on her heels and looked at the man, and at the sky, and at Samuel's face, which had gone patient in the way it went patient when he was waiting for her to reach a decision he couldn't make for her. The math was immediate and brutal. She had flour for 8 days, 14 logs, 1 functioning axe, no medicine, no doctor within 40 miles, no one to call for help and no time to call them even if there were someone. She thought, he will be dead by morning regardless of what you do. She thought, you cannot move 220 pounds of unconscious man up a frozen hill when you are one woman who hasn't eaten a full meal in 4 days. Then her hands moved, not decision, exactly. Reflex, maybe, the reflex of hands that had been the ones doing the surviving long enough to have opinions. They went into the deep interior pocket of his coat, searching for identification, for any information about who she was looking at, before she decided what the situation required of her. They closed around something heavy, cold, smooth in the specific way of worked metal. She pulled it out. The pocket watch sat in her palm and filled it. Gold. Not gold-colored, not gold-plated, but the real thing, dense and warm-toned even in the gray morning light. The case engraved with a pattern of overlapping lines too precise to have been done by any craftsman in this territory. She turned it over. The chain attached to it was thick link, each piece substantial. When she bounced it once in her palm, she felt the weight of it against the lines of her hand like a statement of fact. She knew gold. Thomas had worked a mining claim for 8 months, and she had handled enough raw ore in those 8 months to understand the difference between what this was and what everything else was. This watch was someone's entire season of luck made portable. This was boots for Pearl and flour, through spring and glass for the broken window, and salt pork and medicine, and a side of beef and seeds for March, and a new axe head that wouldn't split at the handle. And she stopped herself. Let the calculations run out. The man made a sound, low wet. Not a word, not consciousness, just the body doing what bodies did when they refused to stop, which was its own kind of argument. Ruth looked at the watch in her hand, looked at the man, looked at the darkening mid-morning sky and the snow still packed against the cut bank and the long, steep path back up to the cabin. She put the watch back in his pocket. She put it back because a dead man's possessions were a scavenger's prize, and she was not a scavenger. A living man with a gold watch owed a debt, and debt was something she understood with her whole body. the architecture of it, the weight of what was owed and what was owing, and the particular honor of keeping the two sides of the ledger straight, even when no one was watching. Especially when no one was watching. Samuel, she stood up. Her knees protested with the grinding she'd been ignoring since October. Go to the shed, bring the canvas tarp, the heavy one with the brass grommets in the corners. He was already running. It took 2 hours to get the man up the hill, and there was nothing in those 2 hours that Ruth would ever describe to anyone. She tied rope through the tarp grommets, rolled the unconscious bulk of him onto the canvas, with efforts that grayed the edges of her vision twice, and pulled. She pulled with her whole body angled against the slope, boots finding purchase where they could and sliding where they couldn't, the rope burning through her gloves and into the flesh beneath. Samuel pushed from behind, throwing his slight weight against the man's boots with everything he had, his face gone past red and into something quieter and more determined. They didn't speak. There was nothing to say that the work wasn't saying already. By the time they hauled him onto the porch, Ruth's hands were bleeding inside her gloves. She didn't discover this until she pulled the left one off and saw her palm. She put the glove back on and kicked the cabin door open with her boot. Pearl was standing in the interior, with a candle in both hands, the flame tilting in the draft from the door. Her face showed the calm watchfulness she brought to alarming situations. Not frightened, just paying close attention, storing what she saw. Hold the candle steady, Ruth said. Stay back. They got him through the door and across the floor and onto the bed. The only bed, Ruth's bed, the one she and Thomas had shared, and that she had slept in alone for 2 years. And he was so large that when he settled onto the rope-strung mattress, the frame sagged until it nearly touched the floorboards, and the whole structure groaned under the redistribution of weight like a bridge being asked to hold more than it was built for. Ruth stood straight. Let her back have 3 seconds of not being bent. Then she got to work. He was burning. She understood this before she finished removing the buffalo coat, before she cut away the buckskin shirt with her dull shears. The fabric beneath was gray with grime and saturated black at the shoulder, glued to the wound by dried blood and the beginning of something worse. The heat coming off him was the wrong kind, the kind a body produced when it had turned its full resources against something invading it. Pearl. Ruth dipped a cloth into the bucket she'd set to warm near the stove. Hold the basin and don't move your feet. Pearl held the tin basin with both hands and watched with the clear-eyed attention of a child who has never been taught that difficult things were worth looking away from. Ruth pressed the hot cloth to the wound. The man convulsed. All of him, every pound, every inch, went rigid at once, and a sound tore out of his throat that was not quite a scream and not quite a word, somewhere between the two, and his left arm swung out with the mechanical force of a body acting entirely without a mind behind it. His hand locked around Ruth's wrist. The grip was absolute. Her forearm bones ground together. She did not gasp. She did not plead. She reached for the heavy iron spoon on the stove shelf and brought it down across his knuckles. His fingers loosened. She pulled free, stepped back, and rubbed her wrist with her other hand while she looked at his fever-flushed face. I am keeping you alive, she said, her voice level and not unkind but entirely clear. The next time you grab me, I'll find a less comfortable way to do it. He didn't hear her. The fever had him entirely. He moved through the delirium in the way of someone who was not anywhere near this cabin, his head turning side to side against the thin pillow, his cracked lips forming words she had to lean in to catch. Not names, not prayers, not the desperate scrambling after mercy she might have expected from a man this close to the edge, shipping contracts, land figures, timber rights. The low, methodical murmur of a man dictating terms in a meeting that wasn't happening. And then, clear as water. The deed is in the left pocket, Harlan. Crane doesn't get anywhere near the deed. Ruth straightened slowly. Crane. She put the name in the part of her mind where she kept things that needed context before she could use them. And she went back to work. The storm settled in that night and stayed for 3 days. The wind found every weakness in the cabin's chinking and drove cold through each one with the efficiency of something that had been doing this for 1,000 years and knew exactly where the gaps were. Ruth packed the worst of them with strips torn from a wool blanket she couldn't spare. The firewood burned at twice the rate she'd planned for, because keeping a fever patient in a Colorado winter required a different kind of heat than keeping 2 children, sustained, even, unrelenting, and every log she put in the stove was a calculation against what was left stacked outside. She and the children slept on the floor near the stove. The boards were cold in the absolute way of stone. They didn't hold heat. They conducted cold upward, patient and thorough. Ruth woke every hour to feed the fire, and every 2 hours to work water past the unconscious man's lips, tilting his enormous head with both hands and using a spoon to deliver it slowly enough that he wouldn't choke. Between these tasks, she lay on her back and listened to the storm and did the numbers, which never resolved the way she needed them to. The resentment was real. She didn't pretend otherwise, at least not to herself. She resented the wood. She resented the food, thin broth from rabbit bones, the last of what the traps had given her, fed to a man who wasn't awake to receive it. She resented the floor, the cold, the particular sound of his breathing, which was loud and ragged and took up all the air in the small space. She let herself feel all of it because denying it would have been a luxury, and she had given up luxuries 2 winters ago. She kept working anyway. The third morning, the storm broke. The silence that replaced it was so complete that Ruth sat up from the floor before she'd finished deciding to, her body responding to the change in sound before her mind caught it. The fire had burned down. She fed it without lighting a lamp, moving through the dark cabin by the geography she knew in her bones. Then she went to check the man. His breathing had changed. Still labored, still a long way from easy, but slower. The frantic working quality of it had eased into something more deliberate. The red lines that had been tracing outward from the wound 2 days ago had pulled back toward the center. When she pressed the back of her hand to his forehead, the heat she found was still elevated, but no longer the terrifying blaze of the first night. He was going to live. She was fairly certain he was going to live. Ruth sat on the wobbly stool and wrung a clean cloth in the basin and pressed it to his forehead and held herself still for a moment, which she could rarely afford and took now, because it was the middle of the night and no one was asking anything of her, and some part of her needed to exist without being asked anything for just a few minutes. Without the fever color in it, his face was stark. Not handsome in the way of men who had been told they were handsome. The nose had been broken and healed at its own judgment more than once, and the jaw was too heavy for any adjective that's soft. But it was a face that had been somewhere real, that had paid the full price of the country it had moved through. She'd learned to trust that kind of face. Her hand moved before she'd sanctioned it. She was reaching for the cloth, meaning to wring it out again, and instead her fingers brushed the hair at his temple, gray at the roots, darker at the ends, damp with cooling sweat. And she went very still when she understood what she'd done. She pulled her hand back, curled it into a fist in her lap. 2 years since she'd touched another adult with anything other than purpose. She hadn't understood until this moment how thoroughly she'd cauterized that whole range of need, had sealed it over with work and arithmetic, and the daily requirements of keeping 3 people alive. 4 seconds of unplanned contact and the scar tissue had cracked open along its entire length. She did not like this. She folded it back up, tucked it away, and stood Ma, Samuel's voice from the hearth, quiet but awake. She looked at him. He was sitting up in his blankets, firelight catching on the planes of his face, and for a terrible half-second he looked so much like Thomas that she had to let the moment pass before she could speak. "You should be asleep." "I was checking something." He stood and crossed the floor in his sock feet, and when he reached her he opened his hands. 5 coins. Gold. Double eagles. $20 apiece. The kind of coin that didn't appear in this part of the territory without a very specific kind of person carrying it. $100. Ruth stopped breathing for the length of several heartbeats. She knew what $100 meant. It was every version of relief she'd been calculating against since August, made solid and stackable in her son's small hands. It was flour through spring. It was Pearl's boots and medicine, and glass for the window, and salt pork enough that the children would stop waking up in the night because their stomachs were noisy. It was the axe head that wouldn't split. It was the repair to the porch step she'd been stepping around for 6 weeks. It was winter becoming something survivable instead of something to be outraced. "He's rich, Ma." Samuel looked at the man in the bed with the tone he used for facts. "Are we going to keep it?" She held the coins in her palm. She held them long enough that Samuel began to look uncertain, which he almost never did. Then she walked to the shelf above the stove, where she kept the chipped ceramic jar full of sewing supplies. She opened it, moved the needles and thread to one side and dropped the 5 coins in. They settled with a series of heavy, muffled sounds, dense and final. "We don't steal," she said. Her voice came out less solid than she'd intended. "He'll settle accounts when he wakes up. Those stay there until he does." Samuel looked at the jar, then at his mother. The expression on his face was the expression of a 9-year-old absorbing a lesson he couldn't quite decide was wisdom or stubbornness. And deciding provisionally to trust that it was one of them, he went back to his blankets. Ruth sat down at the table and did not look at the jar, and did not think about what was in it, and worked on Samuel's boot sole until the candle burned down too far to see by. Morning of the 5th day arrived grey and windless, the storm having spent itself entirely, and left a world that was white and absolute and brutally quiet. Ruth was at the table with Samuel's left boot in her hands, working a rusted needle through the toe leather where it had split. The work was slow. The needle was the wrong size and kept slipping, and her right thumb had been punctured twice already, and the leather at the toe was thinner than she'd realized, which meant the repair was going to hold for 2 weeks at most before she was back at the same problem. She was deciding whether it was worth the thread when the bed ropes shifted with the sound of deliberate movement. She tied off the stitch she was on, cut the thread with her teeth, set the boot down. Only then did she turn. The man was awake, not surfacing, not half-conscious, fully awake, his eyes open and moving through the room with an efficiency that stopped her breath for a moment. He looked at the door first, then at the rifle, then at the sleeping shapes of the children near the stove, then at her. The eyes themselves were a pale grey, the precise color of sky in the hour before a hard storm committed to itself, and they were completely, unsettlingly clear. He was taking inventory. She recognized it because she did it herself every time she entered an unfamiliar space, mapping exits, cataloging threats, establishing the facts of where you were and what you had to work with. Except he was doing it from a bed he couldn't get out of, which meant whatever his situation was, his instincts had stayed operational through 5 days of fever and delirium. The silence between them had weight. "Where's my coat?" His voice was wrecked, 2 stones grinding at the bottom of a dry well, but it was not confused, not disoriented, not the voice of a man just returned from the edge. It was the voice of a man who woke up in strange rooms and wanted information. Ruth felt the irritation move through her chest, clean and familiar. Not "where am I?" Not "who are you?" Not. And this was the one she kept returning to, "Thank you." "Good morning to you too," she said. She stood up, her knees giving their usual commentary, and went to the water bucket. She broke the skin of ice on the surface with the tin dipper and poured a measure into a cup. She walked to the bedside and held it out. He looked at the cup, then at her. Then he planted his left elbow against the mattress and tried to push himself upright. The color left his face so quickly it was almost interesting to watch, the blood simply evacuating, and what replaced it was a gray-white that looked like river clay in winter. His right shoulder had other ideas about the whole enterprise and communicated them at volume. He made a sharp sound through his teeth and went back down, his chest working hard, a new sweat breaking across his forehead from the effort. He lay there for a moment, angry in the specific way that large men were angry when their bodies refused the instructions they gave them. "You took a rifle bullet to the shoulder meat," Ruth said. She was not unkind about it, she was simply accurate. "It festered deep before I got to it. 3 days ago I dug the lead out with a paring knife. The stitches are holding, but they'll tear if you move wrong, and I have nothing left that's clean enough to rebandage it. So I'd suggest staying flat." He looked at her with eyes that were deciding something about her. "Water," he said. Ruth held the cup where it was and looked at him. He looked back. The cabin was very quiet. Pearl slept on. Samuel had gone still in the way of a child pretending to sleep who was absolutely not sleeping. Something moved through the man's jaw, a grinding down. The visible work of a pride that was being asked to do something it found genuinely difficult. The pause before his next word was long enough to mean something. "Please." She stepped forward and slid her free hand behind his neck. He was terrifyingly heavy, even in this small way, the back of his skull like a stone in her palm, and lifted his head just enough. She brought the cup to his lips. He drank with the completeness of someone who had been without water long enough that the body had stopped being polite about needing it. Water running down his chin and soaking into the collar of what remained of his shirt, and he emptied the cup entirely. She lowered his head and stepped back, Name, he meant hers, Ruth Hadley. She set the empty cup on the table. This is my property. My children. Samuel and Pearl. She looked at him steadily. Now, who are you? And who shot you, Boone Callahan? A fractional pause, the kind she was beginning to recognize as his version of deciding how much to give. Out of Denver, and the shooting, dispute over a land deed. His voice had smoothed marginally with the water, the gravel in it settling. It'll be resolved. Ruth let the silence sit for a moment, the way you let a pot sit to see if it would boil. People don't usually shoot each other over paperwork, Mr. Callahan. They shoot each other over money or over lies. Usually both at once. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile, something more guarded than that, a recognition of a thing said accurately. You're a practical woman, Mrs. Hadley. I'm a hungry woman. You've been bleeding on my only mattress and burning my winter wood for 5 days. I don't have the energy for anything that doesn't move us forward. She turned to the stove and ladled oatmeal into a bowl. Thin oatmeal, the kind stretched with water, the kind that had been the same meal for 4 days running. She brought it to the stool beside his bed and held a spoon near his mouth. He looked at what was in the bowl. What is that? Breakfast. I'd rather not. Suit yourself. She pulled the spoon back and started to stand. Wait. The word came out before he'd finished deciding to say it. He swallowed something that was not oatmeal. I'll eat it. She sat back down and fed him in silence, and he ate with the mechanical resignation of a man doing a necessary thing, his jaw working steadily, his eyes drifting to the window where the oil paper let through a flat grey morning light. Between spoonfuls he looked at things. Her cuffs, frayed at the wrists. The floor where a board had warped and left a gap she'd stuffed with burlap. The window, Pearl's boot on the floor near the hearth with its feed sack packing visible at the toe. He was reading the room. She understood this. She let him read it because there was nothing in it she was ashamed of, and because people who read rooms carefully were people who understood that rooms told the truth about the lives inside them. You saved my life, he said, when the bowl was empty. He said it to the ceiling, not to her, and the tone was precise. Not gratitude, not sentiment, but the acknowledgement of a fact being added to an account. My son found you in the willows. She scraped the last of the oatmeal from the bowl. I wanted to leave you for the coyotes. You're too heavy and you eat too much. He turned his head and looked at her then. Not the inventory look. Something different, something that was actually seeing rather than cataloging. Then why didn't you? Her hand went still on the spoon. She thought about the watch. The cold gold weight of it in her palm. The decision that hadn't felt like a decision so much as a fact her hands had arrived at before her mind caught up. She met his eyes, those storm grey eyes, and she held them without flinching and without giving him anything he hadn't earned yet. The ground is frozen solid, Ruth said, and I don't have a shovel strong enough to bury a man your size. 9 days after Ruth pulled Boone Callahan out of the willows, the flour barrel hit bottom. She knew it was coming. She'd been counting the days against the supply since the 3rd morning, had stretched it further than she'd thought possible through a series of small deprivations she hadn't announced to the children, and that the children, being her children, had noticed without mentioning. But knowing something is coming and meeting it are different things, and when she upended the barrel and tapped the staves and collected 2 tablespoons of pale dust in the scoop, the fine tremor that moved through her hands surprised her with its honesty. She stood at the table with her back to the room. Behind her, the bed ropes shifted. Boone had been sitting up for 2 days now, propped against the log wall, the patchwork quilt over his legs. The worst of the swelling in his shoulder gone down to a hard knot of scar tissue that he tested every morning with his good hand, methodically, the way a man assessed damage to something he needed operational again. He had been watching her since the first day he was awake enough to watch anything, and he had been doing it with a thoroughness she'd learned not to bother resenting because resentment required energy and she was running short. You're out, he said back. I have enough for hardtack. She kept her back to him. The tremor in her hands was nobody's information but hers. Flour and water on the skillet. For the children. Not a question. Don't tally my meals in my own house. She turned then, because the pressure behind her sternum required facing something, required directing itself somewhere. I know exactly what I have and what I don't. I've been knowing it longer than you've been conscious. He looked at her with those grey eyes that didn't flinch and didn't soften. He'd been watching her not eat since Tuesday. She understood that now. "Bring me my coat," he said. "You're not leaving. It's below zero out there and the snow is past your knees in the open. You'd make it to the tree line. I'm not going anywhere. Bring me the coat." She got it from the peg by the door, dropped it across his legs with less gentleness than the situation required, and felt no particular regret about that. He worked his good hand into the deep side pocket and pulled out the pocket watch, checked the interior pockets. His hand slowed, moved through the lining. Still, the fire was the only sound in the cabin. He didn't look at her. He finished his examination of the coat's interior, methodical, unhurried, and withdrew his hand empty. He held the watch and opened the case. The ticking was loud in the silence. "Samuel." His voice was even. Samuel looked up from the pine scrap he'd been whittling in the corner, a small knife in his careful hands. "You know Whitmore's trading post?" "Yes, sir." "South along the creek, about 3 miles. Take this." He held out the watch by its chain. The gold caught the firelight and threw a brief flash across the low ceiling. "Bring it to Jed Whitmore. Tell him Boone Callahan sent you. Tell him to hold the watch as collateral and load a sled with what he thinks is fair. Flour, salt pork, coffee, sugar, dried fruit if he has any, dried apples if he has those, and if there's beef hanging in his ice house, have him put a side of it on too. He knows my credit. He'll do it." Samuel was already on his feet. "Stop." Ruth moved to put herself between her son and the door. She looked at the man in the bed, at his large, weather-wrecked hands and his storm-colored eyes, and the absolute certainty with which he'd just issued instructions in her house to her child. "You don't run things here. I know I don't." He looked at her without defensiveness, without apology, with the directness of someone who had decided that directness was the only currency worth spending. "I ate your winter stores, Mrs. Hadley. Now your children are going without. That's not sentiment. That's an account that needs balancing. And this is what I have available to balance it with." The math of it landed before she could stop it from landing, because it was accurate. That was the infuriating thing about this man. He kept being accurate in ways she couldn't argue with. She looked at Samuel, at his thin face with Thomas's patience in it, at Pearl, who had come quietly to stand at the edge of the scene, one hand on the table watching. Ruth stepped aside. "Bundle up properly," she said to her son, "the wool neck scarf. Both mittens." Samuel was out the door in 2 minutes flat, the watch chain glinting once in the wedge of cold light before the door swung shut behind him. Ruth stood in the middle of her own floor and looked at the man in her bed, and the man in her bed looked back at her, and the fire worked at the silence without making much progress. "The money," she said. She went to the mantel shelf, took down the ceramic jar, carried it to the bedside and upended it over the quilt. 5 double eagle coins tumbled out and settled into the fabric, heavy and still and gleaming. Boone looked at the coins, looked at the jar, looked at Ruth. "I didn't spend them." The words came out without the flatness she'd aimed for. She let them. "I wanted to. I told myself you were dying anyway. Then I told myself you owed us for the work. Then I put them in the jar because every time I thought about spending them, it felt like something that would stay on me, and I've got enough that stays on me already." He was quiet for a long moment. "I know you took them," he said. "I assumed you did. You checked the coat?" "I checked the coat the first morning I was clear-headed enough to check it. And I knew you hadn't spent them because you were still stretching the flour." He looked at the 5 coins on the quilt, then at her hands beside them, rough-knuckled, work-scarred, still carrying the marks from the rope on the day she'd pulled him up the hill. A person who takes something and then can't use it didn't really take it. She opened her mouth to argue this. "Keep them," he said, before she could. "Call it payment for the knife work and the nursing and the floor you've been sleeping on for 9 days on my account. My life's worth more than $100, Mrs. Hadley, and we both know it." His voice was level, not magnanimous, simply transactional, the voice of a man closing a line item. "I pay what I owe. That's what I owe you for keeping me breathing." Ruth looked at the coins. At his hand resting on the quilt near them, she picked them up, one by one, put them in her apron pocket, where they settled with a weight she was going to feel all day. "It's not settled," she said. "No," he agreed. "It isn't." She went back to the stove, put the kettle on, stood at the window and watched the white world outside, and waited for Samuel to come back with the sled, and tried to understand why she felt less relieved than she'd expected to. 9 days after Ruth pulled Boone Callahan out of the willows, the flour barrel hit bottom. She knew it was coming. She'd been counting the days against the supply since the 3rd morning, had stretched it further than she'd thought possible through a series of small deprivations she hadn't announced to the children, and that the children, being her children, had noticed without mentioning. But knowing something is coming and meeting it are different things, and when she upended the barrel and tapped the staves and collected 2 tablespoons of pale dust in the scoop, the fine tremor that moved through her hands surprised her with its honesty. She stood at the table with her back to the room. Behind her, the bed ropes shifted. Boone had been sitting up for 2 days now, propped against the log wall, the patchwork quilt over his legs. The worst of the swelling in his shoulder gone down to a hard knot of scar tissue that he tested every morning with his good hand, methodically, the way a man assessed damage to something he needed operational again. He had been watching her since the first day he was awake enough to watch anything, and he had been doing it with a thoroughness she'd learned not to bother resenting because resentment required energy and she was running short. "You're out," he said back. "I have enough for hardtack." She kept her back to him. The tremor in her hands was nobody's information but hers. Flour and water on the skillet, for the children, not a question. "Don't tally my meals in my own house." She turned then, because the pressure behind her sternum required facing something, required directing itself somewhere. "I know exactly what I have and what I don't. I've been knowing it longer than you've been conscious." He looked at her with those gray eyes that didn't flinch and didn't soften. He'd been watching her not eat since Tuesday. She understood that now. "Bring me my coat," he said. "You're not leaving. It's below 0 out there and the snow is past your knees in the open. You'd make it to the tree line. I'm not going anywhere. Bring me the coat." She got it from the peg by the door, dropped it across his legs with less gentleness than the situation required, and felt no particular regret about that. He worked his good hand into the deep side pocket and pulled out the pocket watch, checked the interior pockets. His hand slowed, moved through the lining. Still, the fire was the only sound in the cabin. He didn't look at her. He finished his examination of the coat's interior, methodical, unhurried, and withdrew his hand empty. He held the watch and opened the case. The ticking was loud in the silence. "Samuel." His voice was even. Samuel looked up from the pine scrap he'd been whittling in the corner, a small knife in his careful hands. "You know Whitmore's trading post?" "Yes, sir." "South along the creek, about 3 miles. Take this." He held out the watch by its chain. The gold caught the firelight and threw a brief flash across the low ceiling. "Bring it to Jed Whitmore. Tell him Boone Callahan sent you. Tell him to hold the watch as collateral and load a sled with what he thinks is fair. Flour, salt pork, coffee, sugar, dried fruit if he has any, dried apples if he has those, and if there's beef hanging in his icehouse, have him put a side of it on too. He knows my credit. He'll do it." Samuel was already on his feet. "Stop." Ruth moved to put herself between her son and the door. She looked at the man in the bed, at his large, weather-wrecked hands and his storm-colored eyes, and the absolute certainty with which he'd just issued instructions in her house to her child. "You don't run things here. I know I don't." He looked at her without defensiveness, without apology, with the directness of someone who had decided that directness was the only currency worth spending. "I ate your winter stores, Mrs. Hadley. Now your children are going without. That's not sentiment. That's an account that needs balancing. And this is what I have available to balance it with." The math of it landed before she could stop it from landing, because it was accurate. That was the infuriating thing about this man. He kept being accurate in ways she couldn't argue with. She looked at Samuel, at his thin face with Thomas's patience in it, at Pearl, who had come quietly to stand at the edge of the scene, one hand on the table watching. Ruth stepped aside. "Bundle up properly," she said to her son, "the wool neck scarf. Both mittens." Samuel was out the door in 2 minutes flat, the watch chain glinting once in the wedge of cold light before the door swung shut behind him. Ruth stood in the middle of her own floor and looked at the man in her bed, and the man in her bed looked back at her, and the fire worked at the silence without making much progress. "The money," she said. She went to the mantel shelf, took down the ceramic jar, carried it to the bedside and upended it over the quilt. 5 double eagle coins tumbled out and settled into the fabric, heavy and still and gleaming. Boone looked at the coins, looked at the jar, looked at Ruth. "I didn't spend them." The words came out without the flatness she'd aimed for. She let them. "I wanted to. I told myself you were dying anyway. Then I told myself you owed us for the work. Then I put them in the jar because every time I thought about spending them, it felt like something that would stay on me, and I've got enough that stays on me already." He was quiet for a long moment. "I know you took them," he said. "I assumed you did. You checked the coat?" "I checked the coat the first morning I was clear-headed enough to check it. And I knew you hadn't spent them because you were still stretching the flour." He looked at the 5 coins on the quilt, then at her hands beside them, rough-knuckled, work-scarred, still carrying the marks from the rope on the day she'd pulled him up the hill. A person who takes something and then can't use it didn't really take it. She opened her mouth to argue this. "Keep them," he said, before she could. "Call it payment for the knife work and the nursing and the floor you've been sleeping on for 9 days on my account. My life's worth more than $100, Mrs. Hadley, and we both know it." His voice was level, not magnanimous, simply transactional, the voice of a man closing a line item. "I pay what I owe. That's what I owe you for keeping me breathing." Ruth looked at the coins. At his hand resting on the quilt near them, she picked them up, one by one, put them in her apron pocket, where they settled with a weight she was going to feel all day. "It's not settled," she said. "No," he agreed. "It isn't." She went back to the stove, put the kettle on, stood at the window and watched the white world outside and waited for Samuel to come back with the sled. Samuel came back at mid-afternoon with the sled loaded to its rails and the look of a boy who had done something real and knew it. Jed Whitmore had apparently taken the watch, confirmed the name, and moved immediately. The sled carried a 50-pound sack of flour tied at the neck, a cloth bag of coffee beans, salt pork wrapped in brown paper, a twist of sugar, dried apples, and at the back, roped separately, a solid side of beef that was going to last them into February if she was careful about it. Whitmore had also sent a small paper parcel of baking soda, which she hadn't asked for and which made her throat tighten in a way she dealt with by immediately beginning to unload the sled. The cabin smelled different that evening. Salt pork in the iron skillet, real coffee. Pearl ate with the focused solemnity of a child experiencing something worth concentrating on, her fork moving in steady rhythm, not talking, not looking up. Samuel ate the same way. Ruth ate standing at the stove and tasted nothing because she was watching them eat, and that was the better meal. Boone ate from a bowl she'd set on the bed rail and said nothing, which was the right thing to do. When the children were in their blankets and the fire had settled, Ruth cleared the table and sat down with the lamp and her mending. The needle she'd been fighting with all day had finally given up its argument and was moving through the leather the way she'd needed it to. She worked in silence. Boone was still awake. She could tell by the quality of it. Awake still was different from asleep still, the difference between something resting and something thinking. "The deed," he said. After a while, Ruth set down the boot, got up, went to the apron hanging by the door, and reached into the deep left pocket. The land deed was folded the way she'd folded it on the first morning, the creases softened from 10 days against her hip. She set it on the table between them without sitting down. The silence in the room changed in the way silences changed when something that had been pending became present. "I found it the first day," she said. "When I cut your shirt away, I read it." He looked at the document. Something was moving behind his eyes, working through several things before it arrived somewhere. "How much did you understand?" "Enough. 14,000 acres, Valley Ridge Section 7, Callahan Ridge Holdings filed at the Santa Fe Land Office in May." She paused. "Callahan Ridge Holdings?" Something shifted in his expression, the slight adjustment of a man who had not expected her to name the company and was deciding how to account for her having done so. "My lawyer's suggestion," he said. "Cleaner for territorial filing purposes than filing under a personal name. Less exposure if a claim gets challenged." He reached out and took the deed, unfolded it, checked the edges the way a man checked something he'd been carrying a long time and needed to know was still intact. Refolded it along its original lines. "I bought the valley to run a rail spur through the ridge. The Colorado Central needs a depot junction at this elevation. The creek gives year-round water for the boilers, and the grade through the upper section is workable. I filed the claim in May." He held the refolded deed in his large hands and looked at it. "I was coming here to survey the depot site when Edgar Crane caught up to me on the South Trail." Crane. The name she'd been holding without context for 10 days finally had its shape. "Your partner," she said. "My partner." The 2 words, the second one landing harder than the first. 15 years. I laid my first track in 61, and he was the man who read the terrain for me, could look at a hillside and tell you what the grade would cost before you ran a measurement. I trusted his numbers more than my own. He set the deed down on the table and pressed his palm flat over it. He found a buyer willing to pay 3 times what I paid for the valley, a land syndicate out of Santa Fe. They want the ridge access for a competing spur line, and if they control this land, the Central can't build the depot. He stopped. The something behind his eyes had arrived somewhere. When I wouldn't sell, Crane decided to take the deed and sell it himself. Ruth sat down across from him. He shot you, she said. He shot me. She looked at the deed under his hand. At the hands themselves, large and steady and winter raw. The hands of a man who had built things with them before he'd had the money to pay other people to build things for him. You said he was your partner for 15 years. He was, and you trusted him, completely. He didn't say it like a wound. He said it like a fact he had finished being surprised by. His wife and Margaret were friends. He stood at the graveside with me when she died. He paused, and something crossed his face in the instant before he controlled it. Something specific and quiet and entirely unperformed. I built things after Margaret died, contracts, acquisitions, lines. Kept myself occupied in the way that occupied substitutes for something else for a while. Crane was part of all of it. He looked at the deed. Finding out a person is not who you understood them to be. It doesn't just change what you think of them. It changes what you think you were, for having trusted them. The fire made its small sounds. Pearl made a small sound in her sleep and settled. Ruth looked at this man in her bed, her husband's bed, her house, her floor he'd been bleeding on for 10 days. And she thought about the pocket watch she'd put back in his coat, about the 5 coins she'd put in a jar, about the fact that she had known who he was, structurally speaking, before he'd told her a single word about himself. Margaret, she said, 4 years ago. Typhoid, brief and complete, the way certain pains got compressed by time into the smallest possible package that still contained all of them. There was no warning. 3 days. Thomas was 3 days too, she said. Chosera, he looked at her then. Just, look, she had not said that to anyone. Not to Jed Whitmore. Not to the children. Not to the pine tree out back where she went sometimes to have a conversation with someone who couldn't answer. It had come out simply and without ceremony, which was perhaps the only way it was ever going to come out. I'm sorry, he said. So am I, she said, meaning all of it. His loss and hers and the general condition of losing people before you were finished with them. They sat with that for a while, in the way of 2 people who had each paid a price that the other recognized, and the lamp burned between them, and outside the December wind had nothing particular to say. You own the land under this cabin, Ruth said finally. I own the section, yes. Your husband homesteaded without a deed. I know, she had known this for 10 days. She had turned it over every way it would go and arrived at the same place each time, which was that the fact was what it was, and there was no productive way to be angry at a dead man for it. What does that mean for us? He looked at her. The question was honest and he answered it honestly. Right now it means nothing. When the snow melts and I'm able to travel, I'll need to file the survey for the depot site with the territorial office in Pueblo. Whatever gets built here will determine what the land gets used for, he paused. I don't have plans to displace anyone. Plans change, some do. He held her gaze, and there was nothing in it that she could identify as evasion. Some don't? Ruth looked at the deed under his hand, and at the ceramic jar now empty on the shelf behind him, and at the window where the oil paper moved slightly in a draft she hadn't found the source of yet. Then she picked up her mending and went back to work, and the needle moved through the leather and the fire settled, and Samuel's breathing from the floor near the stove was the slow rhythm of genuine sleep. She worked until the lamp burned too low to see by. When she finally lay down on her blankets near the stove, she could hear from the quality of the dark that Boone Callahan was still awake at the other end of the room. And she understood that he was going to be awake for a while yet, turning things over the way she turned things over, doing his own version of the math. She let the darkness settle around her. The jar was empty on the shelf. The deed was on the table where she'd left it, or where he'd left it. She'd stopped caring whose it technically was in the moment they'd both laid hands on it. The flour was full and the salt pork was wrapped and the children were warm and the man in her bed was going to live. It wasn't settled. He'd said so himself, but it was, for this particular night, enough. The provisions from Whitmore's changed the cabin in ways Ruth hadn't anticipated. Not just the smell of it, though the smell was different. Salt pork and real coffee replacing the thin, watery scent of stretched oatmeal that had been the cabin's atmosphere for 3 weeks. Something in the air itself shifted. The particular tension that lived in a space where there was not enough of something necessary, food, warmth, any margin at all, had eased by 1 degree, which was not the same as easing entirely, but was enough to notice in the body, in the way the shoulders sat differently when they weren't braced against the next shortage. Ruth noticed it in the children first. Pearl stopped waking in the night. Samuel's hands, which had developed a fine tremor she'd been watching and not commenting on, steadied over the course of 4 days. These were small things. They were everything. She noticed it in herself last, which was characteristic. What she didn't anticipate was learning to read Boone Callahan. It happened the way most things happened in a space this small. Not through intention, but through proximity and repetition. He was there when she woke, and there when she went to sleep, and there in all the hours between. And a person paid attention whether they meant to or not. She learned the specific sound of him when he was asleep versus awake. Asleep, he breathed evenly and was entirely motionless, the stillness of a large animal that had learned long ago that stillness was its own kind of safety. Awake, there was a quality of attention in the room, a directed awareness. Even when he appeared to be looking at the ceiling, she learned that he ate fast. Not greedily, efficiently, the way a man ate who had spent years in conditions where meals didn't wait. She learned that he tested his shoulder every morning with his good hand, working through a series of small movements, cataloging what had improved and what hadn't with the detachment of someone assessing equipment rather than their own body. She learned that he watched Samuel do mathematics with an attention he didn't announce, and that after 3 days of watching he said, once, quietly, "You're carrying the 7 wrong. When you carry a number, it belongs in the next column, not the one you're working in." Samuel had tried it, had gotten the answer right on the first attempt. Had looked at Boone with the expression of someone who had just discovered that a tool worked. Ruth had come in from the woodpile to find her son doing long multiplication with focus she'd never managed to produce in him through direct instruction, and she'd stood in the doorway for a moment and not said anything. What she did not learn, not for nearly 2 weeks, was the full shape of what Boone Callahan was carrying. He gave information the way he gave everything, precisely, without surplus, only when the situation required it. She had the bones of it, the deed, the valley, crane, the rail spur. But bones were not the whole animal. The night she got the rest of it started with the deed, she had left it on the table after their conversation, and it had stayed there, neither of them moving it, the way objects sometimes stayed in the place where a difficult thing had happened, because moving them felt like claiming something that hadn't been fully resolved yet. On the 12th evening, when Pearl was asleep and Samuel was somewhere between, Ruth set 2 cups of coffee on the table and sat down across from the deed and looked at it. After a moment, Boone reached from the bed and took the cup she'd placed at the near edge of the table. The fact of 2 cups and no comment required was its own conversation. "Crane was in your fever," she said. He turned the cup in his hands. "What did I say? Keep the deed away from Crane. Keep it in the left pocket." She looked at the folded document between them, and a name. Harlan. Something moved across his face. Brief and controlled, but she caught it. Harlan was what I called him. His given name. Edgar Harlan Crane. He set the cup down. We used given names with each other. 15 years of given names. He was quiet for a moment in which the fire said something neither of them needed to interpret. I built the first line with 30 men and a surveying kit I bought used from a man in Cincinnati. Harlan read the terrain. I ran the numbers. For the first 4 years, we didn't pay ourselves. Everything went back into the next section of track. He looked at his hands, the hands of a man who had driven stakes and strung line and carried timber before he had the capital to pay other men to do it. When Margaret died, he handled everything I couldn't handle. The condolence letters, the business correspondence, the decisions that needed making while I was not available. For 6 months after she died, I was not fully available, and he kept things running. Ruth listened. She understood that this was not easy to say, and that it was being said anyway, and that the being said anyway was significant. "And then he tried to kill you," she said. "And then he tried to kill me." He picked the cup back up. "The buyer he found, the Santa Fe Land Syndicate. They're offering $40,000 for the valley section. My purchase price was $12,000. He looked at the deed. Harlan's share of the difference would have been $9,000. That's his number, as it turns out. $9,000 is where Harlan Crane stops being the man I knew and becomes someone else entirely. Ruth sat with this. With the arithmetic of betrayal, the specific dollar amount at which 15 years of partnership and trust and standing at a graveside became negotiable. Did you know he had a number? She asked. Everyone has a number. His voice was level, not bitter, the levelness of a man who had looked at something clear-eyed and decided to continue looking. I thought I knew where his was. I was wrong about the amount, and I was wrong about the principle. Those are different kinds of wrong. The principle being that he had one at all. The principle being that I was in it. She looked at her coffee. Outside, the December wind was doing its patient work on the chinking, finding the gaps she hadn't found yet. The candle on the table leaned slightly in a draught from somewhere. "Margaret," she said, not intruding, offering. He didn't answer immediately. The pause was not the pause of someone deciding whether to trust her. It was the pause of someone deciding which true thing to say. "She argued with me about everything," he said, finally. A quality entered his voice that she hadn't heard there before. Not softness exactly, but a change in texture, the way a river changed where it widened. Color of paint, placement of furniture. The route I planned for the 63 extension, which she was wrong about, and I told her so, and she spent an hour explaining why I was wrong about her being wrong, and she was correct. He turned the cup once in his hands. I thought I found it exhausting. After she died, I understood that what I'd found exhausting was being known. Having someone who had formed opinions about me and held them and revised them and held them again. That kind of attention. He stopped. The Denver house has 17 rooms. I haven't been in most of them since. Ruth looked at this man. Enormous, weathered, self-contained in the way of things that had learned to be. And she understood something she hadn't had the information to understand before. The railroad and the land deals and the 17-room house and the 15-year partnership. These were the structures a person built when they needed to fill a space that had been left by something else. She understood this with her whole body. Thomas couldn't do the arithmetic, she said. The survival kind. He was good at everything that didn't require knowing when to stop hoping. She wrapped both hands around her cup. He brought us here because I suggested it, and he wanted to try. And he tried everything I suggested because he believed in my judgment, and I thought that was love, and it was love, and it was also. He left all the hard decisions to me, everyone. And I resented him for it sometimes, and then he died, and I would have given anything to have him leave the hard decisions to me for one more day. Boone said nothing. He didn't try to resolve it, didn't offer the comfort that would have made it smaller. He just let it be what it was. She respected him for that more than she could have explained. He's buried out back, she said. Small pine tree. Samuel planted it the spring after. I saw it from the porch, Boone said. When I started going outside, she nodded. That was enough of that. They finished their coffee. Samuel had gone genuinely to sleep somewhere in the middle of it, his breathing slow and regular from the floor. Pearl hadn't moved. The fire had burned to coals, and Ruth got up to feed it. And when she sat back down, she picked up her mending, and Boone leaned his head back against the log wall. And they sat in the late-night quiet of the cabin, without making it into something that needed to be named. 3 days after Ruth's return, Edgar Crane came back. This time he didn't come to the cabin. Jed Whitmore's boy arrived at mid-morning with a note in his mother's careful handwriting. Jed's wife was the writer of the family. That said simply, Crane is here. Has papers, showing them to anyone who'll look. Thought you should know. Ruth read it twice. Set it on the table. Papers, she said, to the room in general. Boone was on his feet by the window, which he'd taken to standing at in the mornings for 20 minutes at a time, building back the endurance that 5 weeks of horizontal recovery had cost him. He was a very large presence at the window. The light fell across him from the left and showed the full extent of what the territory had done to him over however many years he'd been moving through it. Not damage exactly, but a certain weight of experience laid into the structure of his face the way weather laid itself into stone. Injunction, he said, without turning from the glass. Crane filed faster than Blythe expected. An injunction pending the hearing freezes the deed. I can't act on the land while it's in effect, which means the depot plans stall. which means Crane can tell everyone in this territory that the claim is in legal dispute and they'd be unwise to make arrangements with me, and he's showing it at Whitmore's, because Whitmore's is where everyone comes. He's building the story before the facts settle. He turned from the window. His eyes had a particular quality that she'd only seen in him twice before. A compression of something that had been running hot, brought down to operational temperature through pure will. He doesn't need to win the legal case if he can make me look like a bad bet. Ruth was already putting on her coat. Mrs. Hadley. Don't. She buttoned the coat with the efficiency of someone who had made the decision before she started talking. I know what you're going to say. You're going to say that you can handle this, which is true in a general sense, but not in the specific sense of handling it today, at Whitmore's, while you're still not riding distance from this cabin. She took her hat from the hook by the door. I've been going to Whitmore's my entire time in this valley. I know those people. Crane doesn't. Wen will be there. Wen is there to gather information. He's not going to do anything in the middle of Jed Whitmore's trading post in front of 8 locals. She pulled her hat on. I'm not going to accuse Crane of anything. I'm going to tell the truth about what I know, which is what Jed Whitmore and those ranchers will believe, because I'm the one they've been buying credit from and settling accounts with for 2 years. Boone stood in the middle of the room and looked at her. She looked back. Samuel, he said, still looking at her. Can you handle the fire for a couple of hours? Yes, sir, Samuel said. Ruth opened the door. The walk to Whitmore's took 40 minutes. The cold was the dry, clear cold of a day after wind, the kind that felt almost manageable until you'd been in it long enough to understand it was only being quiet, not kind. She walked steadily and thought about what she was going to say and how to say it, which was what she always did before any situation that required precision. You did the preparation before you arrived, so that when you arrived you could be entirely present. Whitmore's was full. Fuller than she'd expected for a mid-December morning, which meant the news had gotten out and people had come to see the shape of it. She recognized most of them. Aldous Cooper, who ran cattle on the north pasture and made decisions slowly but held them once made. The Brennan brothers, both of them, which was less usual. Jed Whitmore behind his counter, his face in its careful neutral. 2 women whose husbands were wintering in Pueblo and who'd come in together for supplies and stayed when they saw the gathering. Crane was at the center of the room holding a document. He held it the way people held things they wanted others to look at, casually, like he'd almost forgotten he had it, so that looking at it was the natural thing. Silas Wen was in the corner near the dry goods shelves. He registered Ruth's entrance with a movement of his eyes that didn't move his head. Mrs. Hadley, Crane's warm voice. What a coincidence. Not much coincides in a valley this size, Mr. Crane. She didn't stop moving until she was standing in a place where everyone in the room could see her without turning their heads. I heard you had papers to show people. A legal document. Yes. I thought the community should be aware. What is it? She looked at Aldous Cooper rather than Crane, because Cooper was the one who mattered here. Cooper and the Brennan brothers and the 2 women from the North End whose names she knew and whose children she'd seen born. An injunction, Crane said, freezing the Valley Ridge deed pending a court hearing in Denver. The claim is under dispute. What's the dispute? Ruth asked. She was still looking at Cooper, a prior agreement between partners that was violated when Mr. Callahan filed the claim without proper consultation. Is the deed's authenticity in dispute? A pause. Small, but present. The manner of acquisition. I asked about the authenticity, she said. Is the deed genuine, or isn't it? Crane adjusted his grip on the document. The territorial court has not yet. She turned to Whitmore. You saw the deed when Samuel brought the watch in. I did, Jed said. He had the satisfied look of a man who had been waiting for the conversation to arrive at a point where he could speak usefully. Territorial seal, 2 witnesses, land office registration number. Look genuine to me. It is genuine, Ruth said. To the room in general, in the same voice she used to report the weather or the state of the creek. I've seen it myself. I've held it. It was filed at the Santa Fe land office in May of this year under the name Callahan Ridge Holdings. And there's a lawyer in Denver who can verify every detail of that filing. She paused. An injunction isn't a judgment. It means someone has asked a court to look at something. That's a long way from the something being wrong. There are complications, Crane said, still pleasant. The pleasantness was beginning to wear thin in a way that was visible under the right light. Prior agreements between partners create obligations that don't always appear in filed documents. That's what the hearing is for. She looked at him, directly, the way she'd looked at him the first time and every time after. Then something else came to her, the name from the fever, the name she'd been carrying for weeks without its full context. She said it plainly, the way she said all true things. You go by Edgar now, but in Mr. Callahan's fever he called you Harlan, Edgar Harlan Crane. She watched his face. The name a man uses for someone he trusted absolutely. The room shifted. Not dramatically. A small collective stillness, the kind that happened when something specific had been said in a space full of people who understood specificity. Crane looked at her for a moment in which his pleasantness completed its transition into something that had given up performing itself. You're very thorough, Mrs. Hadley. I listened carefully, she said. It's useful out here. She looked at Jed. Jed looked back at her with the expression of a man who had just seen something confirm something he'd suspected for weeks. The Valley Ridge deed is legitimate, she said to the room, not to Crane. I'll stake my credit on it, for whatever that's worth to the people in this room. She set 4 cents on Jed's counter for the salt she'd come for. Good morning, Jed. She walked out. On the porch, she stopped and breathed the cold air in through her nose and out through her mouth, twice. Her heart was going faster than usual. She let it settle. She had given them one specific true thing that Crane couldn't counter without confirming it, that Boone had trusted him enough to use his middle name, which was the name of the man who'd stood at a graveside, not the name of the man who was now standing in Whitmore's with a legal injunction. The room would remember that. She walked home in the cutting wind and arrived back to find the cabin unchanged. Samuel at the table, Pearl doing something with a piece of yarn in the corner, Boone standing at the window with his large hands loose at his sides watching the path. He turned when she came in. Whitmore, he asked. Jed heard me before he heard Crane, and I told them the name. She hung her coat. Edgar Harlan Crane. The name from your fever. Boone was very still for a moment. You connected that. I've had weeks to think about it. She went to the stove. He didn't deny it. I said it to his face and he looked at me and smiled. He smiles when he's deciding something. Boone turned from the window. What did the room do? The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something real has been named. She poured water into the kettle. Aldous Cooper will think about it for 3 days and then make up his mind. Jed already had his mind made up. The Brennan brothers were there. They'll talk to every rancher on the North Pasture by Saturday. Boone looked at her across the room. You used the name deliberately, he said. I used the truth deliberately, she said, which is the only way I know how to use it. He wrote 2 letters that evening, one to Harrison Blythe laying out the deed's provenance and Crane's likely legal strategy, and one to the territorial marshal in Pueblo, naming Crane and providing what details he could about the shooting on the South Trail. Ruth sat at the table's far end, while he wrote and memorized the key contents of both as he read them aloud to her, because he understood without being told that she was the kind of person who would want to know what she was carrying, and because she was in fact exactly that kind of person. The hand that held the pen moved with the deliberateness of a man who wrote to be understood, not to impress. The sentences were short and their meaning was precise, and there were no words in them that were doing more than one job. She left before first light. Samuel knew she was going. She'd told him the night before, after Boone was asleep, sitting with the sun on the floor by the stove while Pearl breathed quietly in the firelight. She had explained as much as he needed to know and not more, which was that she was carrying something important to the city and would be back inside of 10 days, and that Mr. Callahan would be here and was well enough to be useful in an emergency, and that Samuel's job was to keep the fire and keep Pearl and keep the door latched at night. Samuel had listened with the particular quality of listening he'd had since Thomas died, thorough, unhurried, already building the plan before she finished talking. Yes, ma'am, he'd said when she was done, and then, is Mr. Callahan going to stay after you get back? She had looked at the fire. I don't know yet, she'd said. Which was true, and which was more than she'd said aloud to herself up to that point. She took the bay mare from Whitmore's, by prior arrangement with Jed, who asked no questions because Jed Whitmore was the kind of man who understood that women who came asking for horses before sunrise in December were not doing so recreationally. He lent her the mare, a pair of saddlebags, and a waxed canvas cover for the bags, and said, "Safe trip, Ruth," that was all. The road south along the creek was passable for the first 6 miles, the snow packed down by enough previous travel to give the mare purchase. After that it opened onto the main territorial road, which was wider but less sheltered, and where the wind had its way with the drifts. Ruth kept her head down and let the mare find her footing and thought about Blythe's address, which Boone had made her repeat 3 times. Larimer Street. Above the ASIC office, 3rd door on the left, and the specific phrases in the letter that Blythe would need to act on quickly. She did not think about the length of the road. She thought about the next mile, and the one after, and the one after that. This was how she had survived most things. She made the lower pass on the afternoon of the 2nd day. The grade was navigable, the snow compressed enough by earlier travelers that the mare moved through it with only occasional difficulty. On the far side the country opened up and Denver appeared in the distance in the way that cities appeared from high ground. A gathering of smoke and geometry against the flat winter sky, improbable and definite at once. She found Harrison Blythe on the 3rd morning of travel, above the assay office on Larimer Street, exactly where Boone had said he'd be. He was a compact man of 60, with the organized energy of someone who had been practicing law long enough to understand that most crises were fundamentally logistical and could be managed if you stayed calm and knew which drawer the relevant document was in. He read Boone's letter standing up, asked Ruth 4 precise questions, asked her to wait, and disappeared into an interior room for 20 minutes. When he came back, he had a sealed response and a second letter already drafted to the Denver Territorial Court, requesting that any filing by Edgar Crane regarding Valley Ridge Section 7 be flagged for immediate notification of his office. Tell him the filing will be contested before Crane finishes the paperwork, Blythe said. Tell him Crane knows this. Tell him that knowledge is what he needs Crane to have. Ruth noted this, took the letters, accepted the cup of coffee. Blythe clerk offered because the temperature outside was 20 degrees, and she had another 4 days of riding ahead of her. And this was not a situation that called for refusing coffee. How is he? Blythe asked. When she stood to go. Healing, she said. Slowly, he heals slowly. Blythe said it with the tone of someone who had been watching this for years. He's careful about it. Doesn't want to have to do it twice. She thought about this on the ride back. The mare was tired and moved at a more considered pace, and the wind on the return leg had shifted to come from the northwest, which meant she was riding into it for the last 30 miles. She had time to think about a number of things. She thought about Blythe saying he heals slowly and is careful about it, and what that meant about a man who had seemed, in the cabin, to be in a constant low-level war with his own recovery. She thought about the letter writing, the 2 precise documents with their efficient sentences. She thought about the specific dollar amount, where a person became someone else entirely, which was how Boone had described Crane's number, and she thought about what her own number was, what someone would have had to offer her to make her into someone else, and she couldn't find it. Which might have meant she was a better person than Crane, or might have meant simply that no one had ever offered her enough to know. She thought about Samuel's question, is Mr. Callahan going to stay? She thought about the 17 rooms in Denver that he'd said he hadn't been in. She came back to the valley on the afternoon of the 9th day, 4 days out and 4 days back with 1 day in Denver, the mare moving with the relieved purpose of an animal that could smell familiar ground. The light was low and golden in the way it sometimes went in December when the clouds broke at the right angle, the kind of light that made the snow look warm. Boone was at the door when she came up the path, not at the window. At the door, coat on, standing at the threshold as though he'd been there for a while, and had decided this was the appropriate place to be. He was upright without the compensatory hunch the shoulder had been producing for the past week. He was standing the full way up, which she noticed before she noticed anything else. She dismounted at the porch rail. He came down the steps, carefully, the shoulder still not entirely right, but moving, and he took the mare's reins from her hands without asking if she wanted him to. Blythe has both letters, she said. He'll contest Crane's filing before it's complete. He said to tell you that Crane knowing it will be contested is what matters. Boone nodded. He was looking at her the way you looked at something you'd been uncertain about the condition of and were now assessing for damage. You're all right, he said. I'm cold and I'm tired and I need to sit down. She pulled off her gloves, and Samuel made the coffee, And I could smell it from the path, so I'd like some of that too. The corner of his mouth moved. She was beginning to catalogue the specific degrees of that movement and what each one meant. This one meant he was not going to say the thing he was going to say, and was choosing not to say it, and was aware that she knew he was choosing. He led the mare to the lean-to. Ruth went inside. Pearl hit her at approximately knee-height, wrapping both arms around her legs and pressing her face into Ruth's coat without saying anything, the way Pearl expressed things that were too large for words. Samuel stood at the table with a cup already poured, looking at her with relief he was managing with moderate success. She sat down, drank the coffee, which was extremely strong and entirely welcome. Let Pearl climb into her lap. Looked at the room, at the fire, the clean floor, the flour sack that had been moved to the high shelf the way she'd asked Samuel to store it, the 2 cups she'd left on the table that morning that had been washed and stacked at the basin. The room had been kept. By her son and by the man now coming through the door stamping snow from his boots, it had been kept well. 3 days after Ruth's return, Edgar Crane came back. This time he didn't come to the cabin. Jed Whitmore's boy arrived at mid-morning with a note in his mother's careful handwriting. Jed's wife was the writer of the family. That said simply, Crane is here. Has papers, showing them to anyone who'll look. Thought you should know. Ruth read it twice. Set it on the table. Papers, she said, to the room in general. Boone was on his feet by the window, which he'd taken to standing at in the mornings for 20 minutes at a time, building back the endurance that 5 weeks of horizontal recovery had cost him. He was a very large presence at the window. The light fell across him from the left and showed the full extent of what the territory had done to him over however many years he'd been moving through it. Not damage exactly, but a certain weight of experience laid into the structure of his face the way weather laid itself into stone. Injunction, he said, without turning from the glass. Crane filed faster than Blythe expected. An injunction pending the hearing freezes the deed. I can't act on the land while it's in effect, which means the depot plans stall, which means Crane can tell everyone in this territory that the claim is in legal dispute and they'd be unwise to make arrangements with me, and he's showing it at Whitmore's, because Whitmore's is where everyone comes. He's building the story before the facts settle. He turned from the window. His eyes had a particular quality that she'd only seen in him twice before. A compression of something that had been running hot, brought down to operational temperature through pure will. He doesn't need to win the legal case if he can make me look like a bad bet. Ruth was already putting on her coat. Mrs. Hadley. Don't. She buttoned the coat with the efficiency of someone who had made the decision before she started talking. I know what you're going to say. You're going to say that you can handle this, which is true in a general sense, but not in the specific sense of handling it today, at Whitmore's, while you're still not riding distance from this cabin. She took her hat from the hook by the door. I've been going to Whitmore's my entire time in this valley. I know those people. Crane doesn't. Wen will be there. Wen is there to gather information. He's not going to do anything in the middle of Jed Whitmore's trading post in front of 8 locals. She pulled her hat on. I'm not going to accuse Crane of anything. I'm going to tell the truth about what I know, which is what Jed Whitmore and those ranchers will believe, because I'm the one they've been buying credit from and settling accounts with for 2 years. Boone stood in the middle of the room and looked at her. She looked back. Samuel, he said, still looking at her. Can you handle the fire for a couple of hours? Yes, sir, Samuel said. Ruth opened the door. The walk to Whitmore's took 40 minutes. The cold was the dry, clear cold of a day after wind, the kind that felt almost manageable until you'd been in it long enough to understand it was only being quiet, not kind. She walked steadily and thought about what she was going to say and how to say it, which was what she always did before any situation that required precision. You did the preparation before you arrived, so that when you arrived you could be entirely present. Whitmore's was full. Fuller than she'd expected for a mid-December morning, which meant the news had gotten out and people had come to see the shape of it. She recognized most of them. Aldous Cooper, who ran cattle on the north pasture and made decisions slowly but held them once made. The Brennan brothers, who worked a silver claim above the ridge. 2 women whose husbands were wintering in Pueblo and who'd come in together for supplies and stayed when they saw the gathering. Jed Whitmore behind his counter, his face in its careful neutral. Crane was at the center of the room holding a document. He held it the way people held things they wanted others to look at, casually, like he'd almost forgotten he had it, so that looking at it was the natural thing. Silas Wen was in the corner near the dry goods shelves. He registered Ruth's entrance with a movement of his eyes that didn't move his head. Mrs. Hadley, Crane's warm voice. Warm as the coat that cost more than her winter stores. What a coincidence. Not much coincides in a valley this size, Mr. Crane. She didn't stop moving until she was standing in a place where everyone in the room could see her without turning their heads. I heard you had papers to show people. A legal document. Yes. I thought the community should be aware. What is it? She looked at Aldous Cooper rather than Crane, because Cooper was the one who mattered here. Cooper and the Brennan brothers, and the two women from the North-End, whose names she knew and whose children she'd seen born. An injunction, Crane said. Freezing the Valley Ridge deed pending a court hearing in Denver. The claim is under dispute. What's the dispute? Ruth asked. She was still looking at Cooper, a prior agreement between partners that was violated when Mr. Callahan filed the claim without. Is the deed's authenticity in dispute? A pause, small but present. The manner of acquisition. I asked about the authenticity, she said. Is the deed genuine or isn't it? Crane adjusted his grip on the document. The territorial court has not yet, Jed. She turned to Whitmore. You saw the deed when Samuel brought the watch in. I did, Jed said. He had the satisfied look of a man who had been waiting for the conversation to arrive at a point where he could speak usefully. Territorial seal, 2 witnesses, land office registration number. Looked genuine to me. It is genuine, Ruth said to the room in general, in the same voice she used to report the weather or the state of the creek. I've seen it myself, I've held it. It was filed at the Santa Fe land office in May of this year, and there's a lawyer in Denver who can verify every detail of that filing. She paused. An injunction isn't a judgment. It means someone has asked a court to look at something. That's a long way from the something being wrong. Mrs. Hadley has a personal interest in this situation, Crane said, and the warmth in his voice had thinned to the wire underneath it. She's been housing Mr. Callahan for over a month. The room shifted slightly. She felt it. The way a room shifted when something potentially interesting entered it. I found Mr. Callahan in a snowdrift on my property, she said, with a rifle bullet in his shoulder, which I removed with a paring knife. I'd have done the same for anyone I found in that condition. She let that land. Then, the question of who put the bullet there might be worth asking alongside the question of who's disputing the deed. The room was very quiet. Crane smiled. It was the smile he'd produced when she'd faced him at the cabin door. The one that had given up warmth entirely and was now simply honest about what it was. You're a brave woman, Mrs. Hadley. I'm a practical one. She looked at him with the same attention she gave everything, direct, without decoration, without threat, and without retreat. And practically speaking, I'd suggest that what you're doing here this morning is better done in a Denver courtroom than in Jed Whitmore's store, where the people you're talking to have been making decisions based on their read of character for a long time, and are fairly good at it. She looked at Cooper. Cooper looked back at her with the slow, deliberate attention of a man who made decisions slowly and held them once made. I'll be at the counter, Jed, she said. I need salt. She walked to the counter, bought the salt, felt the room redistribute behind her as the gathering broke into smaller conversations that were not her business. She didn't look at Crane again, and she didn't look at Wen, and she kept her hands steady on the counter while Jed wrapped the salt in paper, and she paid him and said thank you and walked out. On the porch she stopped and breathed the cold air in through her nose and out through her mouth twice. Then she walked home. The letter from Harrison Blythe arrived 11 days after Ruth had placed the original in his hands. Jed Whitmore's boy brought it on a Tuesday afternoon, and this time Jed himself had written a line at the bottom of the envelope. Crane's man left the valley this morning. Thought you'd want to know. Ruth handed the envelope to Boone, who was sitting at the table with the day's weak sunlight coming through the oil paper window in a pale rectangle across his hands. He opened it and read it and set it down and sat with his hand flat over it, and his face went through something that she gave him the privacy of by going to the stove and finding things to do there that required her attention. Blythe is good, Boone said. After a while, what does it say? Crane filed the morning you arrived in Denver. Blythe had been monitoring Crane's movements through a contact at the territorial court and had advance warning the filing was coming. He had my letter by our formal full challenge to the injunction filed before the court closed. That day, he looked at the letter. The challenge was heard 3 days later. Crane's prior agreement claim requires documentation he doesn't have. A gentleman's agreement that exists only in one man's account of it holds no weight in territorial court. A pause. Blythe says Crane's case is weaker than the injunction made it appear. He needs to have been following this situation for some time to move that quickly. How long has he been following it? Since I told him about Crane's initial approach 6 months ago. He set the letter down. Blythe doesn't wait for problems to arrive. He tracks them from a distance until they're close enough to address. He looked at the window. I need to be in Denver for the full hearing. In person. The injunction challenge was preliminary. The court will want me present for the complete proceeding. Ruth had known this was coming. She'd known it since the night he'd told her about the depot plans, had felt it as a shape in the distance that the days were moving toward. When she said, the hearing is set for 6 weeks out. I need to leave in 2 weeks. When the weather gives a window, he was quiet for a moment. It'll be 2 weeks in Denver, minimum. Possibly 3 if Crane's lawyer extends the proceeding. She kept her back to him. The kettle was doing what it was doing and she was watching it. And when the hearing is over, she said. He didn't answer immediately. She heard the chair move. He was standing up, the sound of his full weight finding the floor. When he spoke next, his voice was closer. I want to come back, he said. She turned around. He was standing at the near end of the table, which put him 10 feet away, which in the cabin was most of the available space. His hands were at his sides, not in his pockets, which she'd learned meant he wasn't managing the conversation. He was just in it. The depot, she said. Yes. And more than that, he looked at her with the full weight of those pale gray eyes, the ones she'd first seen moving through the cabin cataloging exits and threats, and had now watched long enough to know contained more rooms than that initial survey had shown. I want to build a town here, Mrs. Hadley. A depot and a hotel and a bank and a stable that doesn't fall down. People will come through, ranchers, families, men working the new claims on the ridge, and they'll need somewhere to stop that's worth stopping at. I need someone to help me decide what that place is going to be, and I need that someone to be the kind of person who can't be bought and won't run and knows what this valley actually is from the inside rather than from a survey map. Ruth stood at the stove with the kettle behind her and looked at this man, this enormous, careful, deliberate man who had arrived in a snowdrift and been in her house for 6 weeks and had told her more true things in that time than most people told in years. You're describing a business proposal, she said. I'm describing that too. The fire made its small sounds. Pearl was outside with Samuel, their voices carrying faintly through the walls, some game that involved counting. Give me until you get back from Denver, she said. All right. He didn't press it, didn't add to it. That was one of the things about him that she had stopped cataloging and started relying on. He left 14 days later, on a morning that was clear and cold and smelled like the specific mineral cleanness of deep winter. The grey roan he'd arranged through Whitmore was saddled and waiting at the base of the path. He came down the cabin steps with the buffalo coat and the land deed in his inside pocket, and the look of a man preparing to re-enter a version of himself that this particular valley hadn't required. He stopped on the bottom step and looked at Samuel, who was standing on the porch. Keep the wood split, he said. Don't let the stack get below half. Samuel nodded with the gravity of actual responsibility. He looked at Pearl, who came forward and stood at the porch railing with her hands wrapped around the top rail and her clear eyes on his face. Will you come back? She asked, with the pure directness of 6 years and no learned strategy for wanting things. Boone Callahan crouched down, slowly, carefully, the shoulder still on its own timeline, until he was at the height of her eyes, and he said, Yes, I will come back. Ruth looked at the middle distance until she had her face in order. He came back up the steps, stopped in front of her. He was close enough that she could see the particular gray of his eyes in the morning light. Not one gray, but several. The way stone was never one color when you looked at it directly, Ruth, he said. Her name, not the title. Just that. She looked up at him. If Crane makes any move while I'm gone, anything that reaches the cabin, anything that concerns Wen, send word to Blythe directly. Don't wait for me. I know you know. He was quiet for a moment in which the cold stood around them both with perfect impartiality. I'm saying it because I'll sleep better knowing you have his name and address in your head. She held his gaze and let the moment be what it was. Don't let Blythe overcharge you, she said. That corner of his mouth moved, the specific degree of it that she'd catalogued as meaning he was choosing not to say the thing he was going to say. He came down the steps and took the roan's reins and mounted with only one careful accommodation for the shoulder, which was better than last week and would be better still next week. He rode south along the creek. He didn't look back, which she'd known he wouldn't. He was not a man who staged his exits. But he rode at a pace that was slower than necessary for the first quarter mile, and she stayed on the porch in the cold until the willows closed around him. Then she went inside and stoked the fire and counted the wood and thought about what she was going to say to him when he returned, and began carefully to find the words. January settled over the valley like a hand pressing down, not the violent January of the storms. That had been December's work, dramatic and loud and over. This was the quieter version, the one that didn't announce itself, that arrived as a sameness of days, each one grey and cold and indistinguishable from the one before, as though the world had decided to suspend itself in a single held breath and wait. The snow on the north face of the cabin had crusted to a surface hard enough to walk on without breaking through. Ruth walked on it every morning when she checked the woodpile's west exposure, her boots finding the crust and holding the cold so dry it had no smell. She had been alone in the cabin for 11 days. Not alone exactly. Samuel and Pearl were there, and Samuel was carrying more of the practical weight of the place than a 9-year-old should have been asked to carry. Splitting the smaller logs and keeping the water bucket filled and checking the lower traps every other morning without being told. He did all of it with the contained efficiency he'd been developing since Thomas died, the efficiency of a child who understood that the family's margin was narrow and that every person's contribution to it was real. Ruth watched this and felt the complicated thing she always felt watching it. Pride and grief sharing the same space without resolving into either one. Pearl was Pearl. She moved through the cabin's quiet days with her own internal weather, building small constructions out of sticks and yarn, holding extended conversations with the 2 carved wooden figures Samuel had made her the previous winter, observing everything with those clear eyes that missed nothing and volunteered nothing until she'd decided the time was right. On the 5th day of Boone's absence, she asked, without preamble, while Ruth was mending a sleeve, "Does Mr. Callahan have children?" "No," Ruth said. Pearl considered this. "He should," she said, and went back to her stick construction, and Ruth looked at her daughter for a moment, and then looked back at the sleeve. On the 8th night, Ruth woke at 3 in the morning with a knowledge that had been forming below the surface of her awareness for some days and had now finished forming and required acknowledgement. She lay still, counted, let the count run its full course. Then she lay on her back on the floor of her one-room cabin and looked at the low ceiling and thought, with a completeness that was almost peaceful. Well, just that one word, because there was no other word for it, and no room yet for the words that came after. She was 34 years old, alone in a cabin in Colorado Territory in January, with 2 children and a flour barrel that would need replenishing in 3 weeks, and she was carrying a child. The timing was what it was. She had known, in the weeks of late-night conversations, in the accumulated weight of proximity and honesty, and 2 people deciding each other was trustworthy. She had known where things were tending. She had made no decision to stop them from tending that way, which was itself a decision, and she owned it without flinching, the way she owned every decision she'd made in her adult life. What she needed to think about, in the cold dark of 3 in the morning, was not how this had happened. It was what she was going to do with the fact of it. She thought about it for a long time. She thought about it the way she thought about hard problems, not with fear, not with avoidance, but with the methodical attention of someone who understood that a problem looked at directly was less dangerous than a problem looked at sideways. She turned it all the ways it would turn. By the time the fire needed feeding, she had arrived at the same place she'd been arriving at since the night Boone had told her about 17 rooms in Denver, which was that she had already made this decision and was simply moving through the part that came after making it. She got up, fed the fire, put the kettle on. She was going to tell him when he returned. Not before, not in a letter, not through Blythe, not in any way that gave him the information without giving him also the context of her face and her voice and her complete and unambiguous intention. She was going to tell him clearly and without maneuvering, and she was going to let his response be whatever it was, and she was going to proceed accordingly. This was the plan. She held it through the remaining 11 days of his absence the way she held everything she needed to keep, carefully, practically, without letting the holding become its own kind of weight. On the 14th day of January, she went to the tree. She went in the early afternoon, when the light was thin and white, and the wind had gone entirely still, the particular stillness that sometimes preceded a change in weather. The pine tree behind the cabin was small. Samuel had planted it the spring after Thomas died, barely taller than his own shoulder at the time, and it had grown enough in 2 years to be unambiguously a tree rather than an optimistic seedling. Ruth had put a ring of stones around its base the first winter to keep the snowplow from burying it, and the stones were buried now, but she knew where they were. She stood beside the tree in her coat with her hands in her pockets. She hadn't come here to ask for anything. She'd stopped asking Thomas for things the first winter, when she'd understood that the asking was a way of not accepting that he was gone, and that not accepting it was using energy she couldn't spare. She came to the tree when she needed to say something true out loud, and there was no one appropriate to say it to. "There's a man," she said. The tree held its shape against the white sky. He arrived in a snowdrift in November, and I pulled him up the hill with a canvas tarp and Samuel's help, and for the first several days I resented him for existing in my cabin and eating my food, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. She looked at the ring of buried stones. "He's large, Thomas, considerably larger than you. He makes Samuel do arithmetic for reasons he explains in terms of the real world, and Samuel listens to him in a way he never listened to me, which I have decided is about novelty and not about preference." A pause. "He went to Denver 3 weeks ago to deal with a legal matter, and Pearl asked him to his face if he was coming back. He said yes. I believed him. The cold was absolute and the afternoon was very quiet. I'm going to say yes to him," she said. "I've already said it in my own mind. I'm saying it here because you deserve to know before I said it to him, and because I needed to hear myself say it somewhere that cost something, so I'd know I meant it." She stood there for a while longer, not speaking, letting the cold and the quiet be what they were. Then she touched the trunk of the pine tree once, the bark rough under her bare fingers, and went back inside. Boone came back on the 18th day, not the 3 weeks he'd estimated. 18 days, arriving on a Tuesday afternoon in the low gold light that sometimes appeared in January when the clouds broke at exactly the right angle. The light that made the snow look like it had warmth in it instead of just reflecting it back at you. Ruth was splitting wood at the chopping block when she heard the horse. She put the axe down against the block and waited. He came up the path on the grey roan, moving at a pace that was considered rather than fast, the horse picking its way through the packed snow with care. He was upright in the saddle in a way that registered before anything else. The shoulder had been producing a subtle compensation in his posture for weeks, and now it wasn't. He was sitting straight up, the full height of him, which on horseback in the pale afternoon light was a considerable height. He dismounted at the porch rail, stood, looked at the cabin, then at Ruth. "The hearing," she said. Blythe argued the prior agreement claim required documentation Crane didn't have. A gentleman's agreement between partners that exists only in one man's account of it is not enforceable in territorial court. He handed the roan's reins to Samuel, who had appeared at the porch with the soundless competence he'd been developing all winter. "The injunction is lifted. The deed stands. Crane's appeal window is 30 days and Blythe says its chances are around 12%. 12% means something. 12% means Crane knows it's over and is deciding how long to pretend otherwise." He looked at her steadily. "He's done here," Ruth absorbed this. Let it settle into the fact of it rather than the relief of it, which was how she processed good news. She had learned not to spend the relief until the fact was fully solid. "And when?" she asked. "Left the territory the day after you went to Whitmore's the second time." Apparently his assessment of the situation changed. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "Blythe says Crane paid him for a month and got 2 weeks. Pearl appeared in the doorway behind Ruth, registered Boone's presence with a moment of complete stillness, and then crossed the porch and came down the steps and stopped in front of him. "You came back," she said. I said I would. Pearl looked at him with her full unguarded attention. Samuel didn't think you would, she said, with the particular honesty of child reporting facts rather than opinions. He didn't say so, but I could tell, from the lean-to, where he was presumably pretending to be very focused on the horse. Samuel said nothing. Boone looked down at Pearl with an expression that Ruth had not seen on him before. Not the assessment look, not the careful consideration look, not any of the controlled registers she'd catalogued. Something that didn't have a controlled version, something that was simply what it was. Samuel can hold me to it, he said. I came back. Pearl nodded, satisfied, and went back up the steps and into the cabin. Ruth watched her go. Then she looked at Boone, who was looking at the cabin door that Pearl had disappeared through with the expression still on his face, unguarded, present. Come inside, Ruth said. You've been on a horse for 4 days. The cabin received him back with the indifference of spaces that had no opinion about who occupied them, and yet the room changed when he walked into it. Not dramatically. It was the same room, the same low ceiling and warped floor and tilted mantel. But it had a quality with him in it that it didn't have without him, the way a room changed when the thing that belonged in it was returned to its place. Ruth made coffee. Boone sat at the table, the buffalo coat draped over the chair back, and she set a cup in front of him and sat down across, and they drank in the manner they'd developed over 6 weeks of late evenings, without needing the silence to be filled. Samuel came in from the lean-to, stomped the snow from his boots at the door, and sat down at the table with the arithmetic paper he'd been working on. He did not say anything to Boone directly, but he positioned himself close enough to the lamp that the light fell across both the paper and the man across from him, which was its own kind of statement. After a while, Boone said, "You've been carrying the 7 correctly." Samuel looked up. "You can tell from there?" "I can see the column work from here." He studied the paper. "You moved past multiplication?" "Ma taught me long division last week." Samuel paused. "It's harder. Everything useful is." At first, Samuel considered this with the gravity he brought to information from sources he decided were credible. Then he went back to the paper. Pearl climbed into her usual place in the blankets near the stove and was asleep within 20 minutes, as she always was, with the absolute completeness of a child who had no difficulty distinguishing between when she was tired and when she wasn't. The fire worked at its business. The lamp made its small circle of light. When Samuel finally set down his pencil and took himself to bed with the focused intention of a boy who understood sleep was also a form of preparation, the cabin went quiet in the particular way it went quiet when it was only the two of them. Ruth got up and put more wood in the stove. When she came back to the table, she didn't sit. She stood at her end of it, her hands resting flat on the surface, and she looked at Boone and he looked at her, and the thing between them that had been building since November and had no name she'd been willing to use yet was fully present in the room. "I went to the tree," she said. "Before you came back." He waited. "I told Thomas I was going to say yes." She held his gaze with the steadiness she'd applied to everything in her life that required it. Not hardness, not bravado, just the clean attention of someone who had decided what was true and was saying it. "I needed to say it somewhere that cost something before I said it to you, so I'd know I wasn't saying it because I was afraid, or because I was tired of being alone, or because the arithmetic made it sensible." She paused. "I'm saying it to you now. Yes. Whatever you're proposing, the town, the hotel, the rest of it, yes." Boone set his cup down with a care that was not about the cup. "The rest of it," he said, "the rest of it." He stood up. He moved around the end of the table and she didn't step back, because stepping back had never once been her instinct, and he stopped in front of her, and he was very large in the small space, and the firelight came from behind him and made him all warm edges and shadow, and she looked up at him with the full measure of what she'd decided. He put his hand against the side of her face, carefully. The rough warmth of his palm against her cheek had the specific quality of something she'd been not thinking about for weeks, and now that it was real, it was entirely different from not thinking about it. More present, more particular, more unambiguously itself. "The deed," he said, quiet. "What about it?" "I had Blythe draw up a transfer in Denver, the cabin parcel, your land, the ground the tree is on, all of it, transferred to you in your name, independent of everything else. Whether you said yes or no." His thumb moved against her cheekbone once. "You should have had that from the beginning. It shouldn't have been mine to hold." She looked at him for a long moment, You did that before you knew what I was going to say. I did it the first day I was in Blythe's office, before the hearing, the thing this meant. The specific shape of it. A man who had removed his own leverage before he'd asked for anything. Settled into her chest with a weight she hadn't expected, and that required a moment to accommodate. She reached up and put her hand against the lapel of his shirt, felt the solid reality of him underneath the fabric, and tilted her face up because she was a woman who had always moved directly toward the things she'd decided were true. The kiss was not gentle, exactly, and not rough. It was the kiss of two people who had been moving toward this for 12 weeks through an accumulation of iron spoons and gold coins and Denver roads and pine trees and arithmetic in the margins of feed sacks, and it arrived with the combined weight of all of that, which was considerable and lasted long enough to be entirely real. When they separated, Pearl's voice came from the direction of the blankets near the stove, calm and conversational as though she'd been awake for a while. Samuel owes me a penny, Ruth looked over. Pearl had one eye open. You were betting on this? Ruth said. Samuel said Mr. Callahan would come back, but nothing else would happen for a long time. Pearl closed the eye again. I said less than a week, from across the room, muffled by blankets, and what was probably deliberate. I'm asleep. Boone's shoulders moved with something that in another man might have been a laugh, and in him was a breath he let out slowly through his nose, while the corner of his mouth made its full range of movement for the first time. Ruth looked at her children, then at the man standing in her cabin in the January dark. Come sit down, she said. I have something to tell you. She told him plainly. She sat across from him at the table, and she said it the way she said all true things, without building up to it, without the cushioning that softened edges at the cost of accuracy. I'm carrying a child I've known for about 2 weeks. I waited to tell you because I needed to be certain that my answer to everything else wasn't because of this. It isn't. But you needed to know. The room was very quiet. Samuel was genuinely asleep. His breathing had the slow, sunken quality of actual sleep, not the shallow performance of a child pretending. Pearl had gone back under as well, or was at least being gracious enough to let them think so. The fire was the only other sound, working at the pine with the steady patience that fire brought to everything. Boone looked at her across the table. His face went through something. She could see it happening, the way information arrived and registered and moved through the different rooms of him. And he let it happen without stopping it, which she had come to understand was the form his trust took. He didn't control his face for her. He let her see it. What she saw was not alarm. It was not the specific male panic she'd half prepared herself for. The calculation of what this changed, and whether what it changed was workable. What she saw was something that moved from the initial registration of the fact through something careful, and then through something else entirely, something that arrived at an expression she had no prior data point for and had to read fresh. He reached across the table, put his hand over both of hers, covering them entirely, the warmth of it immediate and complete. 2 weeks, he said. About that. While I was gone, yes. He looked at their hands together on the table. She looked at the same thing. The contrast of them, her hands that were scarred and work-rue and capable of most of what the country had asked of them, and his hands that were larger versions of the same thing, the hands of a man who had driven stakes and strung wire and pulled himself up out of snowdrifts before he'd had the money to pay other men to do those things. You're all right, he said. It was not a question. It was the statement of a man checking a fact he needed to be sure of. I'm well, yes, and you waited 2 weeks to tell me, because you needed to know your decision was your own first. Yes. He was quiet for a moment in which the fire said something neither of them needed to interpret. Good, he said. She looked at him. I mean that. His voice was quiet and entirely unambiguous, the voice he used when he was being most direct, which was the voice she trusted most. I don't want you to make decisions because of circumstances. I've had enough of decisions made under pressure to know they don't hold the same way. He looked up from their hands to her face. Whatever you decide, I want it decided by you on your own terms. That's the only version of it that's worth having. Ruth sat with this, with the specific quality of being seen accurately by someone who wasn't trying to manage what they saw. It changes the timeline, she said. Timelines adjust, the hotel plans. Ruth? His voice had a gentleness in it that she'd heard only a few times, the gentleness that existed underneath the efficiency like a layer of different stone. I've been building things for 20 years. I know how to adjust a plan. He pressed her hands once, firmly. What I haven't known how to do for 4 years is come home to something that wasn't empty. He paused. That's the part I don't know how to adjust. That's the part that can't wait. She looked at him for a long moment, then she turned her hands over under his, so they were palm up, and she held his hands instead of being held, and felt the difference between those two things. Tell me what you want the town to be, she said. He looked at her with something she could only describe as startled. Not a large startled, not dramatic. Just the small adjustment of a man who had expected one kind of conversation and had been given something better. What do you want to know? He asked. Everything. Start with the depot and work outward. So he did. He talked for an hour, longer than she'd ever heard him talk at one stretch, and the quality of it was different from the controlled information sharing she'd grown accustomed to. This was a man talking about something he'd been thinking about alone for a long time, and now had someone worth thinking aloud with. The depot would sit at the north end of the valley, where the creek grade leveled out, close enough to the ridge to use the stone for the foundation, but far enough south to avoid the worst of the spring runoff. A hotel first, because people passing through needed somewhere to sleep before they needed anywhere else to be. Then a bank, because without a bank the commerce of the town would leak out to Pueblo and Denver. A stable large enough to service both the rail traffic and the local ranchers. A general store that could absorb Whitmore's trade if Jed chose to merge, or compete with it if he chose not to. A schoolhouse eventually, when there were enough children to justify one. There are already enough children, Ruth said. There are 17 children in this valley and they have no school. Pearl is 6 and can read because I taught her. Half the children her age can't. He looked at her. A schoolhouse, he said. Before the bank, she agreed. They talked about the hotel, who would run it, how it would be structured, what kind of place it should be. This was the conversation where Ruth stopped listening and started contributing, because she had opinions about what kind of place it should be, and they were specific and detailed and had been forming, she realized, since the night Boone had first mentioned it. Not a stopping place, she said, a destination. People who are passing through will stop anywhere. People who want to stay need a reason. She looked at the oil paper window, the way the darkness outside pressed against its pale surface. This valley is worth staying in. Most people don't know that because they've only seen it from the trail. How do you make them know it? You build something that reflects it. Something that doesn't look like everywhere else. She paused. The hotel should use local stone for the ground floor. Not timber framing, stone. It lasts differently and it looks different and it tells people something about where they are before they've even walked inside. Boone was quiet for a moment, and she recognized the quality of the quiet. It was the quality of someone incorporating new information into an existing plan and finding the plan improved by it. Stone, he said. There's good granite up the ridge. Samuel found an outcropping last spring. Of course he did. He said it with the tone she'd heard him use with Samuel when Samuel did something that was in the range of expected and yet still worth acknowledging. The hotel name. Not Callahan's, she said. I know. Not Hadley's either. What then? She thought about it. About the ridge that ran east to west across the entire upper section of the valley, visible from every point below it. The first thing you saw coming in from the south, and the last thing you saw going out. The thing that made this valley, rather than any other ridge house, she said. He turned it over. Ridge house, he said. It's what the place is. Not who owns it, he nodded once. The specific nod that meant something had been decided. Outside, the January night held the valley in the cold that Colorado kept for its most serious seasons. Ruth sat at the table in the lamplight with her hands around her coffee cup and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Something she'd been so careful not to reach for that she hadn't realized she'd stopped being careful about it. The thing you felt when you were building something rather than just surviving something. When the forward motion had a direction instead of just a necessity. She had forgotten what that felt like in the body. She was remembering it now. 3 days after Boone's return, on a morning that was clear and bitterly cold and absolutely still, Ruth walked into Whitmore's trading post with Boone beside her and the deed transfer papers in her coat pocket. She had not planned this as a public occasion. She had simply needed to settle her account with Jed. The $6 from October, that she'd been carrying as a debt, and that was now payable. With the coins Boone had pressed into her hand in November, and Boone had asked to come, and she had said yes. And when they walked through Whitmore's door together, the people already inside understood immediately that something had been decided. Aldous Cooper was there, as he often was on Thursday mornings. The Brennan brothers, both of them, which was less usual. Jed Whitmore behind his counter with his organized stillness. Two women from the North End who came in together on a rotating schedule and who knew everything that happened in this valley before it finished happening. The room did the thing that rooms did when the context shifted. It went slightly quiet and then recalibrated, the conversations adjusting their volume and direction to account for what had walked in. Ruth set $6 on Jed's counter. October's credit, she said. With the interest, no interest on neighbor accounts, Jed said. But he took the money and made the notation in his ledger, with the satisfaction of a man who liked his accounts to be clean. Aldous Cooper looked at Boone from across the room with the slow deliberateness of a man forming an assessment. Heard the Denver court ruled on the Valley Ridge deed, he said. Not a question, but shaped like one. The claim is settled, Boone said. The deed stands. Cooper turned his hat in his hands once, a gesture Ruth had seen him make when he was deciding something. You're building here then? For real, for real? What kind of building? Ruth looked at Boone. Boone looked at her with the specific quality that she'd come to recognize as him deferring. Not because he didn't have words, but because he understood whose words these were. She turned to Cooper. A depot for the Colorado Central Rail Line, she said. A hotel. A schoolhouse first, before anything else, because there are 17 children in this valley and no school. She looked at the Brennan brothers who had 2 children apiece. A bank eventually, and a stable, and a general store that will work with Jed's operation or alongside it depending on what Jed wants. She paused. People who want to work in the construction will be offered work before anyone brought in from outside. That's the arrangement. Cooper looked at her, then at Boone, then back at her with the expression of a man recalibrating something he'd thought he understood. Who's managing the hotel? He asked. I am, Ruth said. The room was quiet for a moment. One of the women from the North End, Margaret Alcott, whose husband ran sheep above the creek, said, matter-of-factly, about time something got built here worth staying for. Jed Whitmore had the expression of a man who had been watching a long play and had just reached the scene he'd expected was coming. The schoolhouse, he said. My wife has been teaching the Brennan children on Sunday afternoons because there's nowhere else. She'd want to be part of that conversation. Tell her to come find me, Ruth said. We'll have the conversation. Boone stood beside her through all of this and said very little, which was what the situation required and which she understood he understood. He was not a man who needed to be the loudest presence in a room to be the most substantial one. He had the particular confidence of someone who didn't need to perform authority because he simply had it, and what he was doing now was making it clear, through where he stood and how he stood, that Ruth Hadley had his full authority behind everything she'd just said. The room understood this. Rooms always understood things that were shown rather than announced. On the walk home, the light had shifted to the thin late-afternoon gold that January occasionally produced as though by accident. Their footsteps made a paired sound in the packed snow, 2 different weights in the same rhythm. 17's children, Boone said. I've been counting them since Pearl was born, Ruth said. Someone has to. He was quiet for a moment in the way of someone fitting a piece of information into the larger shape of a person he was continuing to understand. The Alcott woman, he said. She called you by your first name. I delivered her youngest, Ruth said. You earn the first name after that. He looked at her. You delivered the Alcott child. There was no one else to do it and she needed someone. I'd seen it done twice. She walked steadily on the packed snow too. I wasn't going to let her manage alone. He did not say anything for a long stretch of the path. The cold was the honest kind, not brutal but absolute. The cold that made everything clear by removing everything that wasn't essential. What else have you done in this valley, he said, that you haven't mentioned? Quite a bit, I expect, she said. We haven't been acquainted that long. The corner of his mouth made its full movement. They came up the path to the cabin as the light went from gold to gray. The transition that happened in winter without the gradual softening of other seasons, simply one thing becoming another. Pearl was on the porch with Samuel's whittling knife, which she was not supposed to have, doing something precise and intentional with a piece of pine bark. Ruth stopped at the bottom of the steps. Pearl looked up, looked at the knife, looked at her mother. Samuel said I could borrow it from inside the cabin. I absolutely did not say that. He said it in a way that wasn't directly saying it. Pearl clarified. Ruth looked at Boone. He looked back at her with the expression of a man encountering a domestic situation that was entirely outside his previous experience and finding it, against all expectation, genuinely interesting. "Give me the knife," Ruth said to Pearl. Pearl gave her the knife. The piece of pine bark went into her pocket. "What are you making?" Boone asked Pearl. Pearl considered him. Then she produced the pine bark from her pocket. It was a rough but recognizable shape. 4 legs, a body, a head with ears. "A horse," Pearl said. "For the new stable," she paused. "I thought we should have one before the real ones arrive." Boone looked at the pine bark horse for a moment. "That's practical," he said. Pearl nodded as though this were exactly the right response. She went inside with the focused purpose of a child who had accomplished what she'd set out to do. Ruth stood on the bottom step with Samuel's knife in her hand and looked at the man on the path behind her, who was looking at the cabin door that Pearl had gone through with an expression she had seen on him only once before. In the unguarded moment when Pearl had asked if he was coming back, and he had answered her honestly, "Come inside," Ruth said. "Samuel will have started the coffee. Will he have put in too much?" Inevitably, he came up the path and up the steps, and he held the door for her, and she went through it into the warmth and the smell of coffee that was, indeed, too strong, and the sound of Samuel moving things around in the kitchen area, with the purposeful sounds of someone who had decided that being useful was the same as being welcome. She fixed the coffee, set cups down, he sat across from her. They were at the table again. The table where they'd had all the conversations that had built toward this one. And the lamp was between them, and outside the January night was settling over the valley with the thoroughness it brought to everything. And the fire was doing its work, and Pearl was building something else in the corner with materials she'd gathered from somewhere Ruth hadn't yet identified. And Samuel was pretending to do arithmetic while actually listening to whatever the adults were going to say next. Ruth wrapped her hands around her cup and felt the warmth move through her palms. "The schoolhouse," she said. "I want it built before anything else, before the depot platform, before the hotel foundation, before any of it. You said that at Whitmore's. I'm saying it here too, so we're clear." She met his eyes. "The children in this valley have been waiting longer than we have," agreed, no hesitation, "and the hotel name is Ridge House. That's decided, and I manage it my way. You can have opinions and I'll consider them, but the final word on how it runs is mine, I know." He held her gaze with the steadiness she'd built her recent decisions on. "That's not a concession, Ruth. That's the point." She looked at him for a long moment, at the man who had arrived in November with a bullet in his shoulder and a pocket watch and no manners to speak of, and who had said please when she required it and paid what he owed and told the truth in the specific way of someone who had decided that truth was worth the cost, and who had given her the deed to her own land before he'd asked her for anything, and who had looked at her daughter's pine bark horse with the expression of a man encountering something that mattered. "There's one more thing," she said. He waited, the child. "I'm not asking you to," she stopped. Started again, because she was Ruth Hadley and she did not stop in the middle of true things. "I've managed alone before, and I can manage alone again. That's not a threat. That's just a fact you should have. If this is," she looked at her hands, "if this changes the shape of what you're proposing, I'd rather know now." Boone was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I crouched down in front of Pearl and promised her I'd come back, and I meant it before I knew about the child, and I mean it the same after." His voice was even and entirely certain, the voice he used when he was being most direct. "The child doesn't change the shape of what I'm proposing. It changes the timeline for some of the construction, and it means the hotel will need to be planned with that in mind, and it means..." He stopped. Something moved through his face, the unguarded something she'd seen twice before. "It means I need to be back in this valley in time, which I intend to be." She looked at him. "You're calculating the construction schedule against the due date," she said. "I was doing it while you were talking," he said. "I can't help it." She looked at him for another moment. Then something happened in her face that had not happened in a very long time. Not the small private movement that she kept to herself, but something larger, something that came from deep enough that it was past controlling, and that she let be what it was. She laughed, not politely, not briefly. Really laughed in the way of something that had been stored under pressure for 2 years and had found, suddenly, the place where it was allowed out. It was not dignified and she did not care. From the corner, Pearl looked up with an expression of pure satisfaction. Boone watched Ruth laugh with the expression of a man who had not expected this and was recalibrating everything in response to it, and whose recalibration was visible in the particular way his face opened when it went uncontrolled. "What?" he said. "You," she said, when she could. "You're calculating my confinement into the depot schedule. It affects the labor timeline," he said, and she could hear him working to keep his voice level and failing slightly. "If you're managing the hotel and you'll be Boone?" "Yes, stop calculating." A pause. "I'll try," he said, in the tone of someone making a promise they're genuinely uncertain they can keep. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. The same gesture he'd made 2 nights ago, reversed, and the same warmth in it but different in the direction it traveled. "Spring," she said. "We have until spring. Let's start there." He turned his hand under hers and held it. "Spring," he said. Outside, the January night held the valley in its deep cold, and the ridge stood above it all in the dark. The granite that had been there longer than anyone's plans, and would be there after all the plans were built and were done. Somewhere above the snow line, the creek was running under its ice, doing what it had always done, which was move toward lower ground, which was find the path that the landscape offered and follow it. Inside the cabin, 2 people sat at a table in the lamplight with their hands together, and a small girl built a horse from pine bark in the corner, and a 9-year-old boy did arithmetic he no longer needed to pretend he wasn't doing, and the fire burned the way fires burned when they were properly tended, steadily, without drama, warm all the way to the walls. This was not the ending of anything. This was the end of the part that had been hard in the particular way that things were hard when you were doing them alone, and the beginning of the part that was going to be hard in the different way that things were hard when you were doing them together, which was harder in some ways and easier in others, and was, either way, the only kind of difficulty that led somewhere you wanted to be. Ruth Hadley had been doing the arithmetic of survival for 2 years. She knew how to count what she had against what she needed. For the first time in a long time, when she ran the numbers, they came out even.